Welcome to this lesson on Written Near a Port on a Dark Evening by Charlotte Smith. I really like this poem. It's really dark and powerful, quite brooding, as we'll see in a second. The main ideas I think about it are kind of the way in which nature mimics human emotion and how we're sort of connected to nature in that particular way. So Smith uses the landscape to explore ideas about psychology and the soul and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's kind of connecting the external world to our internal feelings and thoughts and emotions. So yeah, it's a really clever poem, and hopefully you enjoy the lesson on it. I'm going to just read it aloud first because it's not in copyright. It's always good to read poems aloud, so if you have the opportunity to read them aloud yourself, you should do at home as well. Huge vapours brood above the cliffed shore. Night on the ocean settles dark and mute, save where is heard the repercussive roar of drowsy billows on the rugged foot of rocks remote. Or still more distant tone of seamen in the anchored bark that tell the watch relieved, or one deep voice alone singing the hour and bidding strike the bell. All is black shadow but the lucid line marked by the light surf on the level sand, or where afar the ship lights faintly shine like wandering fairy fires that oft on land misled the pilgrim. Such the dubious ray that wavering reason lends in life's long darkling way. Good. So before we start the lesson, if you've not done this poem before, I recommend doing a few of your own annotations, thinking about where can you kind of pick up on imagery or which types of lines stood out to you. Maybe there's bits that you don't know as well that, are really confusing. When I've done this poem with people before, they've quite often found it very confusing to start with. So if you're a bit thinking, what on earth, then you're not alone. A lot of people have that reaction to this poem at first. I've got some vocab here, so I'm going to just put that up on the board so you can have the poem up in front of you. You can have a look at this vocabulary, which roughly fits on the page there. So yeah, while you're doing that, I'll kind of run through some of the key vocab. Vapors are, I think of them as steam or mist, that kind of thing. So they're when liquid turns into a gas, and it's sort of that process where it's just transitioning. So it's not fully a gas yet. It's kind of something that's in a state of transition from liquid or solid into gas. Brood, which is a word that I used right at the beginning, is this idea about thinking heavily. If someone's kind of brooding over a topic, in some ways they might be a little bit depressed or kind of thinking heavily and deeply about it. So yeah, brooding, it's got this kind of dark mood sort of to that word, as well as the idea of thinking deeply. Usually you brood over something that you don't quite fully understand, and that's why you're a bit grumpy about it, because you don't fully know what it means. Cliffed is just a really old word meaning covered in cliffs, so the cliffed shore. Nice little descriptive word if you do any creative writing. Good word to write down there. Mute means silent or unable to speak. Repercussive means having repercussions. You might have heard this term as well, so things that have side effects or after effects from the main thing that happens. In this case, it's also to do with percussion, which is kind of noise and echoing noise and sound. Like percussion instruments in a orchestra, the drums and cymbals, things that make big noises. So yeah, it means echoing, rebounding, reverberating. Drowsy is kind of where you're really sleepy and your head is drooping. Billow is a nice word. It's when a material kind of floats up in air when it's caught by wind. So like sheets being caught by wind, billowing. Sails on a ship, billow as well. Another good descriptive word to write down if you do descriptive writing. Rugged means rough. Remote, far away. Seamen are people that work at sea, so men of the sea, literally. Bark is a boat. The watch is quite an important idea in this poem, a person who keeps watch, a night watchman. Lucid means clear and made of light, another good descriptive word. Surf is what we call the foam on top of the waves on the sea. I'm going to spend a second talking about verifiers. So, by the way, with this vocabulary, if you've not taken my poetry lessons before and you're not sure why I'm going through all this, you can pick up on individual words and actually analyze the meaning of them and specifically why are they used. So the more aware you are of the difficult vocab in a poem, the easier it is to analyze in depth. And if you're aiming for a high grade, then you always want to be getting depth of analysis in there. So you want to zoom in on a word and really consider what does that mean and then how is it reflecting in the poem. So in this poem, verifiers is something that you can definitely zoom in on and explore in detail because they're actually quite relevant to the meaning of the poem itself. So they're will-o'-wisps, which are kind of fairy tale ideas of glowing lights that you might get in a dark kind of environment or landscape, like on a moor or in a swamp at night. Sometimes you see these kind of flickering lights, and there's sort of an old folk tale, or quite a lot of old folk tales about will-o'-wisps where they lead people astray into the bog and they drown, or they lead you off your path. So the idea is that there's these these kind of flickering lights in the darkness, and people, when they're confused and everything's dark around them and they're kind of isolated and lonely, they move towards this light because they think it's a sign of another person or it's a sign of safety, whereas in reality they're not. So there's something kind of magical and folkloric about these fairy fires, but also there's a kind of scientific reason for them. So the reason that people think they happened is that swamps and bogs kind of release gas every so often, and sometimes, I don't even know really how, but they used to think that the gas would catch fire and it would create this kind of phenomenon of seeing little kind of fires all around the moor at night. It's this idea of a small light that seems welcoming but is leading you astray. It's a really important idea for later in this poem. Misled means to lead astray or being led astray. Pilgrim is interesting as well because it has religious connotations, connotations being an important word for poetry analysis. It means the associations or the deeper meanings of something. Again, a way to get a high grade is to go into connotation a lot. So a pilgrim has this kind of religious, spiritual connotation of somebody who's on a spiritual journey. Dubious is something that is suspicious, untrue, that you doubt it, that type of thing. Wavering means kind of hovering up and down, wobbling, a bit like a wave, that kind of movement. Reason is a really important idea in this poem, so make sure that you understand this well because it will help you really unlock the meaning of the poem. So logic and reason are skills that we use to sort of decode the world and filter information in our brains. And nowadays people don't seem so fussed about them. I don't know why, because they're very important skills. I use them a lot myself. But the idea is that you use logic and reason to properly decode the world around you in order to fully understand it. So instead of just experiencing something and reacting straight away, you'll sit and process and think, okay, what are the sensible reactions to this thing? How can I think about it logically or in a way that makes sense? So she's talking about reason, but she has a really interesting comment on reason and how she thinks it's a bit useless. So yeah, we'll come to that later in the poem analysis. Darkling, finally, another good descriptive word, growing dark or covered in darkness. So hopefully they all make sense to you, and hopefully you've had a bit of a chance to do some of your own annotations. If you haven't, just pause me for a second and sketch out a few things before we carry on with the lesson. If you have done that, we're going to move on. So we're going to look at the story first, as always, with poetry. So it's set in a port, which is a kind of harbour, basically, where ships come in from the sea, and it's set at night time. The speaker is looking out at the port, and she can see a vapour, which is sea mist, on top of the shore surrounded by cliffs. It's getting dark and night is falling. It becomes quiet. So we've got this kind of ambience of darkness and silence. The only thing she can hear that breaks the silence is this seawater that crashes against the rocks, so the roar of the seawater. And further away, she can hear the men at sea who are speaking loudly with the night watchmen. So this is a different kind of job that you would have on the boat. So the seamen are people who are kind of like fishermen, and they make the boat function. The watchman is a guy whose job it is a bit like a security guard for a boat, where he sort of stands and watches out to sea. So he's relieved of his duty. It's the end of his day, and he's finishing work. And there's this bell that rings out across the ocean that signals the end of the day when the work on the ship is over. And the speaker is removed from all this. She's watching it from a distance. The blackness of the sea is quite absolute, but there's a single line that disrupts this blackness, and it's the bit where the waves break onto the beach. So there's dark sea, dark beach, and a single strip of white where the foam of the waves is breaking. There are also a few other lights that are in the distance at sea, which are the ship lights shining. So the ship lights show that there's kind of these people dotted out at sea who are still at work or about to come home. And the speaker thinks about these lights, these tiny little dots of light in the vast darkness of the scene that she's experiencing. And she thinks that they're similar to these fairy fires that we were talking about a second ago, the way that they lead wandering travellers astray across dark marshes at night. So she might be thinking that, physically, if she thought, oh, there's a person there with a light, if I walk out to them, I can reach them. Obviously, she wouldn't be able to do that because it's the sea. So there's this kind of physical aspect of the way in which the person in the sea with the light on disrupts the reality of, nature. Like, it's not realistic that someone could just go walk up to them. But there's also this more metaphorical aspect going on, which is that small fires, such as fairy fires and ship lights in the darkness, are similar to the ways in which humans use logic and reason to justify their actions. So this is the bit that confuses people, so definitely take time to process this. If what I say doesn't make sense, go back over it, spend time trying to figure it out, because it's sort of like the linchpin of the poem. It kind of clicks all of the ideas into place. It's the final comment or the final thought that she has. It's also quite an odd idea because it's very different from the attitude that we have in the modern world. So she says that logic and reason is kind of useless in a way, or it's a bit misleading, because we have this very limited knowledge as humans, and we use logic and reason to sort of unlock or demystify a very small aspect of our world, and then we think that we understand it well, but we don't have the bigger picture. So it's like this tiny small illumination is sort of useless, really. We shouldn't just think that humans are so great and we understand everything because we can pick apart and understand one minute aspect of nature or the world around us. So it's kind of anti-scientific, because logic and reason are scientific tools that we use to decode the world. And she's creating a kind of anti-science argument here, because she's saying that, if you spend ages deconstructing and decoding one tiny, tiny little thing and you understand it well, you still don't really understand it because it's decontextualized from the rest. There's nothing, that you connect it to, and you might understand it in a small, minute way, but you also don't really have this kind of deeper, more eternal spiritual knowledge of it. So as a religious writer, she's kind of trying to justify the way in which her God has this perfect knowledge of the world, and the way in which humans have very kind of limited pockets of knowledge that sort of lead us astray, because we just follow those like little individual paths, whereas the rest of the world is kind of darkness to us. So you can totally disagree with that. Or you can totally agree with it. It depends if you're spiritual or not. I mean, even if you're not spiritual and you're atheistic, you could still have that type of attitude to the way that humans use logic and reason. So it's a difficult idea to get around. Make sure that you understand it, because, like I say, it unlocks the rest of the poem for you. So the way I've written it here is that humans might be acting in a way that makes sense to them, but their own capacity to really understand the wider perspectives of life is flawed. And so this leads to flaws in judgment. She's talking about how people get obsessed with single ideas or understanding one single thing, and this makes them lose their way in life because they're kind of fixated on a point rather than looking holistically at the whole. So the fires, I see those as a metaphor for ideas and beliefs that people might latch onto, but that doesn't help them in the long run and only makes sense in the short term. So hopefully, from my rambling, that makes sense to you. But like I say, take time to process it, go back and read the poem again. Make sure that you understand what that means. So the bit where she's saying this specifically as well, I'll just scroll back up to it, is just the last line and a half here. The dubious ray, the ray that we don't trust, that reason, which is always wavering, lends to life. It's also an easy way of saying it is that, in context, something might make sense to us, and then when we look back on it, we think, why did we do that? So even our own logic, the same person at different points in their life can have very different beliefs or reactions to the same situation. I'm sure you've all done something where you've been like afterwards gone, why have I done that? I do it all the time. I have so many things where I do that with, where, I look back on myself a year ago or 5 years ago or something, and yeah, the kind of decisions that I make are really crazy to me now. So that's actually a good thing, I think, personally. I think it shows development, and it shows an ability to adapt and change and constantly grow. So I don't necessarily agree that it's negative, which is what Smith is saying. But I do agree with her that happens, that you get really caught up with something and it seems to make sense. And then when you're out of that situation, you realize it's suddenly not right. So we're going to go a bit deeper into the poem now. So make sure you vaguely understand the main argument of the poem and the main concepts there. And then I'm going to kind of pick apart little details for you. So firstly, we've got a third person omniscient narrator and a Gothic atmosphere. So third person omniscient, this means it's talking in kind of he and she. It's not really talking using personal pronouns like I or we or my. It has a Gothic atmosphere because it's kind of playing on Gothic imagery, so things to do with spooky little fairy fires or darkness, that kind of thing. So to me, that feels quite Gothic. She's writing around the time that Gothic is just starting to become a popular genre, so it is a time for this as well. I think that this is my interpretation, but I think the narrator or the speaker is kind of ghost-like because she's sort of observing everything from a distance. She's very passively commenting on the scene, and she's not a kind of physical presence or actively involved in what's going on. She's taking a very distanced perspective on what she sees. And I think also she's got this sense of connecting the real world to the spiritual or philosophical or metaphorical world around it. So it starts with this quite physical, realistic description, but it very quickly descends into abstract, philosophical, spiritual, and metaphorical thought. So we've got this kind of transition from the reality into the kind of metaphysical world around that. So yeah, we have this idea again about the lights. They seem appealing, but if a person traveled towards them, they would drown at sea. So in the reality of the situation is different from the appearance, the physical appearance. So again, I think the idea of being like, a removed narrator is quite interesting just when we look autobiographically at Smith herself, because she's got this idea of an outside perspective. I get the feeling that not many people at this time have the same attitude to her. She's writing in the 1700s, and this is an age of logic and reason. People love logic and reason at this point, and she's kind of anti-logic and anti-reason. So she's giving us an outside perspective, an unusual take on the world around her, and one that might actually be quite counter to what most people believe in her time. So she had a very difficult life as well, as we'll see in a bit, which could have contributed to her quite unusual beliefs and attitudes. So techniques then. We have quite a lot here. So personification is one of the first ones, I think, that kind of springs to mind. So brood is a verb that an animal, or normally a human, would undergo. So saying that the vapors are brooding, kind of personifying them there, because it's kind of like they're sort of hanging heavy and they're thinking deeply. So it sort of creates this pensive and contemplative mode of being, like sitting and kind of reflecting and thinking deeply about the world, almost in a kind of meditative state, I think. And the vapors are realistic, and they're something that you see as sea mist, but then for her they're also on this metaphorical level where they represent kind of fogginess and lack of clarity and thought. That's kind of how I feel she's using them. So again, these fairy fires, they mislead pilgrims. So they're personified because it's just a fire, but actually seems like it's a fire with an evil intention, or at least mischievous intention. They're deliberately intending to lead wanderers astray. Pilgrims are people on clear spiritual paths, and a fairy fire would divert them from their spiritual path. So again, we have that underlying sense of religion and spirituality, and the way that Smith is trying to conceptualize all of that. A few more techniques, quite basic ones. We have alliteration, which you might have noticed yourself. There's a lot of it. Fairy fires, lucid line, rocks remote, repercussive roar. They just kind of underscore and emphasize the imagery of the poem. So there's a lot of visual and auditory imagery. We can see a lot and we can hear a lot of this poem. And so it draws attention to those images, and it kind of helps delineate the picture that she's trying to create there. In particular, you can call L and F sounds fricative alliteration. So basically this just means that it's using these quite soft sounds like L's, F's. They create, I think, in this poem, a sense of slipperiness and fluidity. And for me, that's linking to the idea that reason can quickly shift, or our perception of reality or of a particular situation is also slippery and fluid, as I was saying earlier. So hopefully you're beginning to see how understanding the overall idea or intention behind the poem then can help you unlock all of the analysis of these individual techniques and terms. So when you do poetry analysis, it's not just about picking out the features. We call that feature spotting. And it's about really understanding how the overall meaning connects to the individual techniques that are being used. So try to kind of get a sense of that as we're going along with this. So structure and form then. When you're analysing, you want to be equally clear on your language, structure and form. So it's important to do all three and be confident on both and not just favour one over the others. So I think the most interesting thing about the structure is it's a romantic sonnet. So it's a sonnet, which is a 14-line poem, a lyric poem, which is something that explores an idea. So it doesn't have a full narrative structure to it. It's just exploring a concept. And yeah, she kind of puts this romantic twist on it. And when we use romantic in literature with that capital R, it doesn't mean love and, marriage and all that kind of stuff. It means sort of a deep connection of emotions to nature and understanding the spirituality in nature and trying to kind of there's this thing called the sublime that you get in romantic literature a lot, which is this sense that there's a deeper, almost unknowable force at work within the natural world, that when humans come into contact with it, they're really humbled and really impressed by it, but also slightly frightened because it's so powerful. So romantic literature tends to try and capture that sense of the sublime in nature, something beautiful but very frightening and far more powerful than an individual human can ever be. So it's blending the idea of Shakespearean sonnets, which is a form of sonnet invented by Shakespeare, and romantic literature into something called a romantic sonnet. It has an AB rhyme scheme, which I think is really clever because it's very clearly tied to the meaning. So the idea of wavering, hovering back and forth between opinions or ideas or perspectives on something. You have it present in the alternate rhyme scheme of the poem as well. And then the final two lines, they actually harmonize into a rhyming couplet that provides this sense of closure on the rest of it. So the rhyming couplet at the end sort of concludes the poem, and it creates a final comment, and it feels a lot more definite than the rest of the imagery, which is more kind of hovering and fluid and transitioning throughout. So this couplet that we're going to kind of have a look at a little bit more here in this section, we have this idea of wavering reason and unreliable thought processes casting doubt in the long, uncertain journey of life. So I think a modern interpretation of this poem, because you always want to be able to analyze stuff from the time it's written and also from now when we're kind of trying to understand it, how it's still relevant to us in the modern world. I would say with this one, it's something similar from saying, kind of modern ideas like follow your intuition or follow your heart. Don't use your head too much. Don't try and skip moment to moment and just focus on those. Just try and kind of be led by your own feelings in life and your own kind of impulses without thinking too much or overthinking or over-analyzing, because the idea of thinking too much will lead you astray. Like if you just follow, if you're kind of guided by your inner sort of either spirituality or personal intuition, then that's a better way to be. That's kind of a modern take on what she's trying to say. So yeah, that final couplet, it just kind of hammers home this point, this idea that she has that actually we're in this world where people use tons of logic and reason, but that's not necessarily a good way to decode our environment. Maybe intuition or spirituality is better. We have a lot of monosyllabic lexis, which sounds fancy, but it just means one-syllable words. One deep voice strike the bell, dark and mute, marked by the light surf. I feel like it's kind of simplistic, but deliberately so. It's using these kind of basic descriptions to depict landscape and humans, but also quite definite because of the monosyllabic nature of it. Like, she's kind of very clear about these particular points. And finally, for structure, we have something called a volta. So it's quite important. Most poetry that's really good, especially lyric poems that explore ideas rather than stories, they have a volta, which is a turning point where something about the mood or the feeling shifts. And after the turning point, you can kind of resolve the problem that you were starting with in your poem. So here, the second stanza kind of switches from focusing on the darkness to the pockets of light more in the poem. All is black shadow, but the lucid line. So it switches from images of darkness to the pockets of light. And we have this idea of a white strip along the shore of the beach. And I feel like there's kind of a focal shift at the end of that stanza as well. So voltas, sometimes you can kind of debate where they come. So there's a shift in perspective from the beauty of nature to the frailty and fallibility of humans from stanza 1 to stanza 2. But then if we look back at the poem, I would say that you could argue also that the volta just appears kind of right at the bottom. Sorry if you can hear my cat in the background. I'm going to just pause a second and go tell her off. Yeah, I have a crazy cat who just really wants to get into this room, and she's just been meowing for the last 5 minutes. So just told her to go be quiet downstairs. So this idea of a volta, I would say you could argue that we have this caesura here, a pause in the middle of the line. It definitely creates a dramatic kind of disruption in the flow of the poem. And so, yeah, I feel like the volta possibly comes there as well. You could argue that. Caesura, if you want to spell it, I'll just kind of type it here. What have we got? I said there's a caesura, and we would say something like the dash at the end of the poem, or in the penultimate line of the poem. Creates a pause where the tone shifts into becoming more definite. And Smith finally presents her opinion or argument. She's kind of up to this point as well, we're sort of like, okay, where are you going with this? You've got this nice weird scene of a beach at night, and it's very dramatic and moody and so on. And then finally she's like, look, I've explained all of the stuff that's going on in the natural world around me, and this is how it connects to my thought about how reason and logic actually lead us astray. So yeah, it's an interesting one as well. You always find more and more stuff every time you go back to a poem. So I've probably taught this poem, I don't know how many times, a lot of times, and I've written and revised this document quite a few times, and then still, as you go through and you explain it, you refine it more. So it's important to always study things and then revise them, not just study them once and hope that you understand them, because every time you return, you might find something new like that. So a couple of ideas to finish off then. Attitudes are really important for understanding the underlying opinions and messages, especially of the writer themselves, and also what is the text trying to convince you of. All of that comes from an attitude. So one attitude that we have is that sometimes it's better to be passive and observe life rather than actively participate. So when we're in this kind of quiet, contemplative, reflective, meditative mood where we're just sort of observing and watching and looking, we might actually find more deeper ideas about existence and human nature than when we're always on the go and we're always physically doing something all the time. So being busy is not necessarily good for spiritual growth or psychological development. Sometimes we need to stop and reflect and observe, which I think is quite an interesting idea. This is quite an important point. It's kind of contextual. So as a woman in the 18th century, men were thought to be very logical and reasonable, and women were thought to be more kind of emotional and less logical. And it was thought that an inferior mind didn't use logic and reason and relied on emotion, and a superior mind would use logic and reason. So she's actually, even though I'm not particularly a feminist myself, as you'll know because I'm always going on about it in my lessons. So if you ever see any of my other stuff, you'll see that. So I'm not kind of strongly feminist or anything like that, but I respect people that react against oppression in their environment at any stage of history. And one of the oppressions in this time was definitely that women were not thought of as being able to be intellectual and educated in the same way that men were, and it was thought to be a biological difference. So with this, I really respect the way that Smith is treating her subject, where she's not saying, okay, women aren't emotional. She's saying that there's some kind of strength and power in being intuitive and emotional, and there's some disadvantages to being logical and not reasonable, but using reason. That sometimes that actually might lead you astray, and intuition and emotion might be a better way of observing the world. So it's quite an interesting kind of way that she's reacting against the boundaries and restrictions of her environment. Another idea here is just a classic romantic idea that man is weaker than nature, and by man I mean humans, not just men. So it's really important, as I was saying with romantic literature earlier, that we are respectful of the fact that nature is far more powerful and eternal than we can ever be as an individual human being. So again, a modern interpretation we can think of as, technology that we have, or however advanced we make ourselves, we're still, nowhere near the complexity of what nature is and how nature functions. So we can make our lives easier by developing ships or developing electricity and lights, or in the modern world, obviously phones, laptops, etc. But does that really, it doesn't make us kind of on the level of nature in our ability to create or kind of adapt the world. So the main outcome of romantic literature is that humans should always stay humble and not be hubristic. We shouldn't have a sense of pride and arrogance in our ability to create, because we can create and we can advance and we can make quite incredible technologies, but at the same time, this is very crude in comparison to what the natural world is capable of. And again, you can take that down a religious or non-religious view depending on what your personal beliefs are. So in this case, because Smith is religious, we have this idea of nature as an expression of God's work on earth. And therefore it's extremely important for someone like her to respect the natural world, because she sees it as, all its variety and complexity is a direct reflection of the variety and complexity in the God that she follows. Another one is about fate. And this is actually a personal criticism that I have about the poem, because I'm not really that into determinism as an idea, which is where you believe that, you're just kind of set in your way and your fate is sort of fixed from the beginning and you can't really change that. I don't really agree with that at all. Some people do, some people don't. So it's very deterministic. So the idea is that, free will, which is part of is kind of tied to the idea of logic and reason, the fact that we have free will and our independent choices and abilities to kind of make decisions and take ourselves down paths that we think we're in control of. Smith is sort of saying, we should probably accept our fate and accept that there's a kind of higher power who has already set out a life for us. We shouldn't really battle against that. Or maybe if you're, again, not religious, accept the chaos of the world that we're placed into. So you can be deterministic and non-religious still, where you think, it's not necessarily that a God has a plan for you, but you think the world is just really chaotic and so crazy, and you can't really help where you're born, so you can't really change anything about the world. So I feel like it's kind of quite deterministic. It's sort of pro-fate and anti-free will. And it's also quite misanthropic, meaning she's a little bit critical of humans, and she doesn't quite like or trust them. And she sort of also doesn't think that they're as clever as they think they are, herself included in this, obviously. So she's misanthropic, meaning she's not humanist, she's not pro-human. She thinks that humans are actually quite flawed, which again is quite typical of a religious person in this time, because it's quite a normal Christian belief that humans are born sinful and flawed and imperfect. So it's quite misanthropic. So these are some criticisms we could have of the poem if you're like me and you agree with, or you prefer free will to the idea of determinism. We also have this idea that life is a spiritual journey, again suggested by this word pilgrim. So the spirituality is kind of embedded in the poem, and it's merged with the landscape. It's not outwardly a spiritual poem. It's just that she is a religious person writing for an audience where everyone is Christian. So everything that the way she kind of filters and interprets her world is just naturally that way, and her intended reader is also naturally that way because of the time period. So context then. The poem is written at the turn of the 19th century. So we're getting out of the 1700s and into the 1800s. Make sure that you know a reasonable amount about the time periods of your texts. Really important to know that, because if you are studying something and you don't really know about the context in which it's produced, I personally feel like you can't really analyze it in as much depth. There's a debate, so there's a kind of critical debate in the literature world where people say, a text is a text and it's good because it's good, and it doesn't really matter when it was made or who made it. So you can distance all of the context from a text and try and understand it just by itself. Or you can do what's called a historicist interpretation and really apply your context to it. And for the types of exams that you do in literature, I really recommend doing historicist interpretations unless you're told not to do that for some reason. So the context always deepens and reinforces your understanding of the poem itself, and you have a kind of respect for the context in which it was produced when you're analysing, rather than just looking at it from your modern point of view. So with that in mind, make sure that you know kind of vague ideas about how people are in the 1700s and how they start to become in the 1800s, and how this is kind of bridging the gap in between. Very important that she led a very sad, tragic life, because a minute ago I was saying about how she thinks, the world is predetermined, there's nothing you can do, and humans are evil. All of those types of ideas sound quite gloomy and depressive and maybe defeatist or negative. But she had a really tough life, so it's sort of understandable why she had these opinions, or how she came to develop these conclusions on life, because they are born of her environment and circumstance. So she was born into a wealthy family, which is why she had a good education, why she was an accomplished poet. But her father was bad with money, and then she was forced to marry someone else who was also terrible with money. So she had lots of children and she couldn't support them, and really struggled throughout her life. So she, because it was an arranged marriage that she disagreed with, she basically called herself a legal prostitute because she felt like her father had just married her off in order to get a bit of money. Because when you marry in this time, especially an arranged marriage, you have to pay a dowry. So the wife's family gets something out of the marriage, like a financial like gift basically out of the marriage. So yeah, her father has really bad spending habits and needed more money, so he's like, oh, I'll just sell Charlotte off to someone. And the person that she sold off to wasn't great either, and he was very wasteful with money and couldn't support the children. He ended up in debtor's prison, which is where if you owed loads of money at this time, they just threw you in prison for being in debt. And then she ended up living with him there, so she lived in prison. And then she wrote these poems partly to make money, partly to kind of keep her spirits up a little bit. And eventually, impressively, she did make enough money for them to get out of prison. So as a woman in this time, she managed to make enough money to kind of support her husband and get him out of the debt that he got himself into. So she's a quite impressive woman. I quite like her for that reason. Her poems are published in a collection called Elegiac. I can never pronounce this word. Elegiac sonnets. Elegies are sad poems about death. So again, her themes are dark, deep, kind of quite depressive themes. So we have a little bit more in romantic literature and sonnets. I've kind of gone through those context points already, so just make sure that you read them. There is a little bit more detail there than what I've already gone into, but I'm going to skip those for the sake of not boring you and making the lesson too long. And again, with Gothic, I kind of mentioned Gothic already. So we're going to just finally look at a few themes and potential essay questions. So a lot of these themes, again, we've kind of briefly covered. You want to sort of consider them in a deep way if you can. So you wouldn't just say the poem explores darkness. Try and break that down into different elements. So here I've kind of broken it into spiritual/physical darkness. Or nature. I would personally go along the lines of nature being connected to a deeper sense of spirituality, or showing evidence for God's work on earth according to Smith, that type of thing. Try and connect it deeper. Or there's something in the natural environment that actually reflects the human psyche and our minds and our souls and the way that we work as well. So yeah, you want to kind of connect those deeper things together that way. And then possible essay questions. When you do these questions, you want to be able to identify the keywords. So the poet's feelings and nature. So you're connecting emotion and attitude to nature. Or Smith and spirituality. So how is she spiritual, and how does she kind of see the spiritual world mapped onto the real world of the port that she's describing? So yeah, so hopefully you feel quite confident on this one now, and you feel kind of confident about how to approach an essay. I would suggest doing some plans. So I've put kind of essay plans here. You can have a look at those. And then I would suggest at least one essay to like fully write and just explore your own ideas on it. Obviously, the interpretations I've given you are my interpretations, so you're welcome to come up with your own as well. And if you do, that's even better than just listening to me. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this poem. I really love this one, and I hope that came across when I was rambling about it. And yeah, it's got a lot of food for thought, so definitely one to return to and get familiar with. So thank you for listening, and I'm sure I'll see you guys soon in a future scribbly lesson. Goodbye for now.